John moved through the cavernous university halls like a shadow at dawn. Silent, unassuming, invisible, his broom whispered soft rhythms against the cracked tiles, sweeping away the crumbs of hurried footsteps and forgotten coffee cups. Students flooded past him, voices loud, eyes locked on their glowing screens, their worlds so full of themselves they didn't notice the man who moved like a ghost through their daily lives. He wore no uniform, just a faded jacket, pockets full of pins and folded notes, the weight of years tucked into every crease on his face. His hands, rough and steady, gripped the broom as if it were a baton conducting an unseen symphony, but John's gaze was sharp, always watching, always remembering. A group of students rounded the corner, laughing, careless, their words floating like smoke in the cold air. "Did you see the new professor? Total genius, they say. Nobody's going to pass his exam," one said. Another scoffed, "I'll believe it when I see it. Finals are a nightmare anyway, dash." John's fingers tightened around the broom handle. His mind raced, not with worry, but with calculation. Every challenge was a puzzle waiting to be solved. But to them, he was just the janitor, the man who emptied their trash, the invisible man. He stopped by a row of lockers, his breath steady despite the noise. A crumpled paper fluttered at his feet, a discarded formula scribbled in haste. He bent down and picked it up, smoothing the creases carefully. His eyes traced the tangled equations, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "They don't see me," he thought, "but I see everything." Behind the hum of fluorescent lights, John's world was rich with detail. The scuff marks on the stairwell walls told stories of frantic late nights. The worn edges of library tables bore silent witness to exhausted students chasing dreams. And somewhere in all this noise and chaos, John found his rhythm. "Hey, John," a voice called out. He looked up to see Maria, a freshman, her backpack slung low, eyes wide with the anxiety of someone new to this sprawling institution. "Morning," John nodded, his voice low but warm. "Do you think I'll make it?" "The final exam is coming. They say it's impossible," she said, biting her lip. John's gaze softened. "Impossible only means untried," he said quietly. "Keep your head down. Keep your eyes open, dash." Maria smiled, relief flickering across her face. She hurried off, and John watched her go. He swept forward, the rhythmic swish of the broom filling the silence he lived in. "They call me invisible. Maybe I am. But beneath that invisibility, beneath the dust and silence, something was awakening, a quiet fire that had smoldered for years, fueled by knowledge they never saw, by dreams they never asked about. The university was a great machine, and John, though unseen, was a part of it. Every hallway, every creaking door, every forgotten corner belonged to him in a way no one else understood. The janitor who knew secrets hidden between textbooks and late-night whispers. The man who was about to step out of the shadows. Because sometimes, the quietest souls hold the loudest truths. And they were about to hear his. The auditorium was packed, hundreds of students pressed into cold metal seats, eyes wide, breaths held tight. The room buzzed with restless energy, a low hum of anticipation mixed with something darker, heavier. At the front, Professor Aldrich stood tall, his silhouette sharp against the bright projector screen. His voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. "This year's final exam," he announced, voice steady but chilling, "will be unlike any before. It is designed not just to test your knowledge, but your limits. Many will fail, some won't even come close, dash." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Whispers erupted like wildfire. "Impossible. There's no way to finish that in time, dash." "Yeah, they say only 1 in 10 pass it, dash." Who would set a test this cruel? It's a death sentence for our grades, Dash. John leaned against the back wall, broom in hand. Blending into the shadows, he didn't need to hear the words to feel the tension slicing through the air. It was everywhere, a palpable weight dragging at the chest of every student. He watched as a cluster of students huddled near the door, faces pale, voices trembling. "I studied all semester. How am I supposed to beat this?" a girl whispered, eyes darting like hunted prey. A boy shook his head, jaw tight. "It's not just hard, it's cruel. I don't even think it's fair, Dash." John's mind raced quietly, absorbing every fragment. The exam wasn't just hard, it was a gauntlet, a beast that devoured hope and spat out despair. He felt a flicker deep inside, not fear, but a spark of challenge. Impossible means untried, he thought again, the phrase steady as a heartbeat. Across the room, Professor Aldridge pulled back a large blackboard curtain, revealing a monstrous grid of complex equations, riddles, and abstract diagrams, a labyrinth with no obvious exit. "This," the professor said, voice low but firm, "is the final exam. You will have 24 hours to solve it. It will push you to the edge. Only those who think beyond the textbooks will survive, Dash." A gasp. Some students exchanged horrified glances. John's eyes locked on the blackboard. The math, the logic, it wasn't just tough. It was a puzzle crafted by a mind that reveled in breaking spirits. The auditorium emptied slowly. Anxiety hung thick in the air like smoke. John moved silently through the halls afterward, catching fragments of conversations. "They'll fail. There's no hope, Dash." "I heard the professor wants to weed us out, Dash." "Maybe I should just drop the course, Dash." But beneath the surface of fear, John felt something else, a challenge that wasn't meant for the loudest or the smartest, but for the quietest minds that saw the world differently. He clenched his fist around the broom handle. "They think this test is impossible because they look at it with fear, but maybe it's a riddle waiting to be unraveled." The campus lights flickered as he passed the library, the pages of forgotten books whispering secrets in the dark. John walked on, invisible to them all, but a storm gathering in his chest. This exam wasn't just a test of knowledge. It was a test of courage. And he was ready. The campus was silent now, wrapped in the deep blue hush of night. The grand university, so alive during the day, now seemed like a sleeping giant, its hallways empty, its classrooms cold and shadowed. John pushed open the heavy door of Lecture Hall 7, the old hinges creaking softly, echoing in the vast stillness. He had finished his rounds early, but something pulled him back here, a restless flicker of curiosity, an unspoken whisper in his mind. His footsteps were soft, almost reverent, as he scanned the rows of desks, their surfaces scratched and worn. And then, a faint glint caught his eye beneath a desk near the back. He crouched, heart quickening. There, lying like a forgotten relic, was a sheaf of papers bound with a loose rubber band, the final exam. John's fingers trembled as he lifted the stack. The header bore the university seal and the chilling title, Final Exam, Advanced Theoretical Problems Dash. His breath caught. The same impossible grid of equations and riddles that had been revealed to the students in the packed auditorium, now resting quietly in his hands. A surge of something wild and fierce flared inside him, a spark that had lain dormant beneath years of sweeping floors and dodging invisible eyes. "This is my chance." His thoughts roared louder than the silence around him. "They see me as nothing, just the janitor, the man with the broom. But inside, I carry the weight of every quiet lesson I've learned, the things I've read in stolen moments, the puzzles I've solved when no one watched." He flipped through the pages, I was tracing every line, every symbol. The complexity was daunting, yes, but beneath it all, patterns began to emerge, like faint stars in a dark sky. John's lips curled in a slow, determined smile. Maybe they don't know who I really am, he whispered to the empty room. Maybe this time, they'll have to dash. A sudden noise startled him, the metallic clang of a loose chair. His breath hitched, heart pounding in his ears, shadows shifted in the corners, but no one came. He pressed his back to the cold wall and sat down on the floor, the exam papers spread before him like a battlefield map. Hours slipped away unnoticed. The night deepened. Outside, the first light of dawn began to crease the horizon. John's eyes burned with quiet intensity, the impossible test no longer a wall, but a door. He felt the stirrings of hope, fragile, yes, but alive. For the first time in a long while, he was not invisible. He was seen by himself. And that made all the difference. The university slept, but John did not. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the empty lecture hall, the world outside faded to silence. Only the faint hum of the bulbs above kept him company, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat matching the pounding in his chest. He sat cross-legged on the cold tile floor, the final exam papers spread around him like scattered stars in a forgotten sky. Each question, once a wall of intimidation, began to fold and unfold beneath his gaze. The language of numbers and symbols slowly revealing their secrets. His fingers traced the scribbled notes he'd begun to make. A line here, a correction there. Every mark a tiny victory against years of silence. They think I'm just a janitor. John's voice was a whisper lost to the empty room, but I've been a student in shadows for longer than they know. His mind flickered back to the small, cramped apartment he'd grown up in, the nights spent under a single dim bulb, devouring every book he could find, the countless moments when hope had seemed just out of reach, crushed by the weight of expectation and dismissal. The clatter of broomsticks and mops in daylight, the casual glances of students and professors alike, a constant reminder that the world saw him as nothing more than a ghost cleaning up after their brilliance. But here, now alone, John was more than that. He was a mind, a fighter, a storm gathering strength. His breath hitched as he worked through a problem that had stalled him the night before. His pencil danced over the paper, weaving solutions, chasing answers. Slowly, the tangled web of equations began to unravel. This isn't impossible. His heart surged. Minutes blurred into hours. The night deepened. The flickering light threatened to die, but John barely noticed. His eyes burned with exhaustion, yet his spirit was alight. The weight of years lifted, replaced by a fierce clarity. He was no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. He was preparing silently, relentlessly for the moment when the world would have to see him. A whisper of doubt crept in. What if I fail? But it was drowned by a louder truth. What if I don't? John folded the paper carefully, pressing his hands together as if holding the fragile thread of his future. For the first time, the impossible test felt like a path, not a prison. Outside, dawn's first light crept through the windows. Inside, John sat ready, waiting. The exam hall buzzed with panic and desperation. Paper crumpled, pens scratched frantically. Whispers swirled like a storm. Students hunched over desks, faces pale, eyes wild. The impossible test grinding their confidence to dust. Is this even solvable? One girl muttered, biting her lip. Another slammed his fist against the table. I'm going to fail for sure, dash. John stood at the back, silent, calm, a shadow among the chaos. His heart beat steady. His hands held a thin envelope, his answers folded inside like a secret weapon. No one noticed him step forward. No one saw the janitor leave his seat. No one heard the quiet thud of the envelope dropping into the submission box. He turned, walked out, invisible, unseen, a ghost fading into the milling crowd. The room erupted with more tension as the final minutes ticked down. When the professor collected the tests, her face was grave. The exam had crushed hope in her students' eyes. The weight of failure lingered in the air. Days later, a hush fell over the university auditorium as she held a single test paper, the one that stunned everyone. "Anonymous," she said, voice steady but heavy with disbelief. "Achieved a perfect score dash." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The top student's name? Anonymous. Whispers turned to rumors. Who was this phantom genius? How could someone ace the impossible? John sat far away, the news washing over him like a silent tide. His chest tightened, pride mixed with fear. "They don't know it's me." His fingers clenched the edge of his coat. A part of him wanted to scream, to shout, to claim his victory. But he stayed quiet, invisible, because this wasn't about glory. It was about proving to himself that he belonged, that beneath the mop, beneath the janitor's uniform, was a mind that refused to be buried. And as the crowd buzzed with questions and awe, John finally allowed himself a small, unseen smile. The impossible had been conquered by the one they never saw coming. The university's marble halls buzzed louder than ever. Whispers followed John everywhere. The janitor, could it be? Eyes narrowed. Doubt morphed into accusation. The dean's office door loomed ahead. Heavy cold. Inside, a dozen professors waited, their faces masks of skepticism. "John," the dean said, voice clipped. "We need answers. Were you the one who submitted the perfect exam?" John stood still, calm as always. The janitor's uniform hung loose on his thin frame. But inside, a storm brewed, quiet, fierce. "I was," he said, voice steady. A murmur rippled through the room. One professor scoffed. "You expect us to believe that?" A janitor. John's eyes met hers, unwavering, unyielding. "Believe what you want," he said softly, "but I'll prove it dash." The room shifted as John pulled out a chalk piece, moved toward the blackboard. Silence fell like a curtain. A complex equation stared back at them, tangled and cruel. John's fingers traced the lines, his mind unraveling the puzzle with practiced ease. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Let's start with the assumptions. See here? The constants." One by one, he solved the problem in real time, breaking down each step with clear logic and precision. Professors leaned forward, eyes wide. The silence grew thick with awe and disbelief. "Impossible," whispered a senior professor. John looked up, meeting their stunned gazes. "I learned this long ago, not from a classroom, from late nights with old books, watching and listening when no one cared dash." His words struck a chord. The skepticism cracked. One by one, questions turned into nods. The walls of prejudice began to crumble. The dean cleared his throat, voice softer. "John, how did you acquire this knowledge?" John swallowed, the weight of years pressed down. "I was invisible here, but I listened. I studied when others slept. I never stopped believing dash." His gaze held the room captive, not just with facts, but with raw truth. "You judged me by my uniform, by my silence. But knowledge doesn't wear a name tag dash. The professors exchanged glances, guilt flickering in their eyes. The janitor had spoken, and for the first time, they saw, the university's grand old walls held whispers, sharp, slicing like winter's chill. Not all were ready. Not all wanted John's truth. The day after the revelation, the faculty lounge simmered with murmurs, some curious, many cold. Dr. Mindel, a tenured professor with silver hair and eyes like sharpened steel, slammed his coffee cup onto the table. A janitor, solving our exam? Ridiculous dash. Across the room, Dr. Vance nodded grimly. It threatens everything. Our order, our traditions, our authority dash. John walked the halls as usual, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him like invisible chains. He heard fragments, snatches of venom wrapped in polite tones. Did you hear? It's a disgrace dash. He doesn't belong here dash. Who knows what shortcuts he took? His jaw clenched. The words were daggers, but the silence inside screamed louder. Why does truth scare them so? He wondered. Is knowledge their possession? In the library, John sat at a corner table, his hands trembling as he held a worn notebook filled with equations and notes. His secret sanctuary. Why can't they see? He whispered to the empty room. I'm just like them. But I'm invisible dash. Later, a confrontation. Dr. Mindel stood before him, voice low, sharp. John, your presence disrupts the balance. You overstep. There are rules, protocols dash. John met his glare without flinching. Rules don't own knowledge, he replied quietly. Mendel's face twisted with anger. This is academia, not just a place to prove yourself. Tradition matters dash. John's fingers curled into fists, the chains rattled. I'm not asking for permission dash. The tension thickened, unspoken battles, fears, resistance. But beneath it all, something new was born in John's chest, a fierce fire. They tried to silence him, to keep him invisible, but he had tasted recognition. And now, he was fighting not just for himself. He was fighting for the right to be seen. The cold walls of the university had echoed with whispers of doubt, but beneath the shadow, sparks began to glow. John felt it first, a quiet knock at the door of his small janitor's closet, just as he finished sweeping the worn linoleum floor. John, it was Emily, a third-year physics student with sharp eyes and a voice that always carried a thread of kindness. She held a stack of textbooks, heavy with promise. I wanted to say, what you did, it wasn't luck, she said, voice low, almost a whisper. John blinked. Unsure, support was a language he hadn't learned to speak yet. Emily continued, if you want, I can help you study. We can work together dash. For the first time in months, a flicker of hope warmed something cold inside him. Words spread like a quiet breeze, changing direction. Professor Albright, the soft-spoken math instructor who rarely spoke out loud, invited John to his office. Your answers showed brilliance, Albright said, sliding a notebook across the desk. You deserve more than a mop and a broom dash. John's heart thundered. Could this be real? A door cracking open. In the weeks that followed, small bridges formed, unseen threads weaving a fragile web of trust. Emily brought her classmates to the janitor's closet, transforming it into an impromptu study room. Flickering fluorescent lights illuminated tired faces bent over formulas and textbooks. John absorbed every word, his mind a sponge thirsting for knowledge denied. The university's bureaucracy, long a fortress against change, began to crack. With the quiet backing of Professor Albright and others, John was offered a chance to enroll officially. Paperwork slid across desks, signatures inked on dotted lines. The janitor was no longer invisible. One chilly evening, standing before a small gathering in a cramped lecture hall, John took a shaky breath. The platform was unfamiliar, but the eyes were no longer filled with scorn, curiosity, respect, even admiration. He began to teach, not from arrogance, but from a deep place of hunger, for connection, for understanding. His voice, once unheard, filled the room with clarity. Students leaned forward, absorbing every word, caught in the quiet revolution of a man proving that brilliance wears many faces. John looked out over the room and for the first time saw himself reflected in their eyes. He was no longer alone, no longer a ghost. He was becoming a beacon. John stood at the edge of the crowded auditorium, the hum of whispered doubts swirling around him like a storm. The university, the grand institution built on tradition, prestige, and 1,000 years of unseen walls, was watching, waiting, judging. He was the janitor who had solved the impossible final exam, the anomaly, the challenge to the system itself. But labels don't dissolve overnight. Professors, faces tight with skepticism, exchanged glances. Students, torn between admiration and disbelief, murmured among themselves. Somewhere deep in John, a fire blazed not of anger, but of something steadier, resolve. The dean's voice cut through the tension, formal and sharp. "Mr. John, this institution has its rules. Your place has never been in the lecture halls, dash." John's throat tightened. He had heard this before, many times. But this time, the words didn't crush him. Instead, they forged a silent vow. He stepped forward. "Places where knowledge grows," he said quietly, voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Not where your title says it should be, dash." The room fell silent. All eyes turned, curious now, not with disdain, but with something unspoken. Hope? John pulled the worn notebook from his coat pocket, the same one he had filled late into the night, solving each question, bending impossible problems into clarity. He began to write on the whiteboard. Problem after problem unfolded under his hand, equations dancing with logic and grace. No hesitation. No apology. The crowd watched, breath held, as the janitor, once invisible, wove brilliance into reality. "You see," John said, turning to face them, "intellect is not a badge given by walls or words. It's the light you carry through darkness, the courage to ask questions others won't. I am not here because I was invited. I am here because I earned it, dash." A professor, face once cold, nodded slowly. "You've broken the mold," she admitted, voice soft. John's gaze swept across the room, lingering on faces once shadowed by doubt. He saw in them a flicker, a seed planted. The old barriers trembled. For the first time, the institution didn't just tolerate change, it faced it. John felt a surge of something new possibility. Not just for himself, but for every voice silenced by expectation, every mind caged by labels. In that moment, the janitor who once swept empty halls became a symbol, a new chapter beginning not just for him, but for all who dare to rise beyond what the world expects. And as the crowd erupted into tentative applause, John understood something profound. True brilliance doesn't ask for permission. It breaks through. It inspires. It changes everything. The auditorium was packed, yet the atmosphere felt different now, warm, expectant. John stood at the front, no longer the invisible janitor, but a man who had carved his name into the very foundation of the university. He held a chalk in one hand, his other resting lightly on the lectern, a quiet symbol of the journey he had traveled. The students before him weren't just faces in a crowd, they were eyes bright with questions, hearts pounding with hopes they hadn't dared speak aloud. Each of you, John began, his voice calm but powerful, carries a spark inside. Not everyone sees it, some never do, but that doesn't mean it's not their dash. He paused, scanning the room, catching a glimpse of a young woman in the front row clutching a battered notebook, a boy in the back with trembling hands, and others whose stories were whispered in the quiet corners of campus. Years ago, he continued, I was the janitor who swept these halls, invisible, overlooked. I learned to listen, to watch, because no one else did. And when the impossible exam came, I found a way not because I was supposed to, but because I had to dash. A breath caught in the room. John's eyes glistened. I wasn't born brilliant. I was born curious. I was born hungry. And I was given a chance to show what was inside dash. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. A student raised a hand, voice trembling. How did you keep believing when everyone ignored you? John smiled softly, memories swirling like shadows. Belief is a quiet thing. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's just a whisper inside when the world shouts no. When I cleaned these halls, I dreamed of a different life. Not because I thought it was easy, but because I knew I deserved it dash. He stepped away from the lectern, walking slowly among them. I want you to know this. No matter where you start, no matter who overlooks you, your mind is yours alone, and it is powerful beyond measure dash. The room seemed to breathe with him, a collective heartbeat, synchronized in hope. Later, outside the lecture hall, groups gathered. Conversations buzzed with new energy. Professors, once guarded, exchanged thoughtful nods. Students approached John, not with hesitation, but with gratitude. One young man, hesitant but determined, spoke up. You've shown us it's possible, that we're not bound by where we begin dash. John looked at him, eyes steady. You're not bound by anything but what you choose to believe. And if you choose to believe in yourself, you can change your world dash. Under the fading sunlight, John's shadow stretched long across the courtyard, no longer a silent figure in the background, but a beacon lighting the way forward. His legacy was more than the perfect exam or the broken barriers. It was the hope he ignited, the countless unseen voices he helped find strength. And as the campus lights flickered on one by one, John felt something he never had before, belonging. Because sometimes the greatest change begins not with power or privilege, but with a single soul daring to step out of the shadows. John was that soul, the janitor who changed the university. The old hallways were quiet again. The echoes of footsteps faded into memory, but the air still held the weight of what had changed. John stood alone beneath the high, arched windows, their stained glass casting fractured light onto his face. Dust motes danced like silent witnesses in the beams. He brushed his hand along the chipped wooden banister, feeling the cold grain beneath his fingertips. The same hand that had once held a broom now held the power to rewrite his story. His eyes closed briefly, and in the silence, a storm of thoughts churned. They never saw me. Not really. But now they did. A whisper of a smile touched his lips. The world outside might measure greatness by degrees, titles, or loud voices, but John knew better. He remembered the nights bent over faded papers, the flickering of failing lights in an empty lecture hall. The hunger that had driven him was not just for knowledge. but for recognition, for the right to be seen, to be heard. His breath came steady. He didn't need applause, not anymore. Because the answers, the real ones, were never in exams or lecture notes or the crowded classrooms. They were inside. Inside the quiet moments where hope fights despair. Inside the unseen mind wrestling with doubt and rising anyway. Inside every overlooked soul waiting for their moment. John stepped into the sunlight pouring through the window. It wrapped around him, a warm cloak of possibility. His voice was steady, though only he could hear it. The greatest minds live in silence, waiting, watching, learning, and when the time comes, they shine dash. Down the hall, distant footsteps approached. He opened his eyes. A group of students passed, their faces lit with the promise of new beginnings. They didn't need to know his story yet. They just needed to believe in their own. John's smile grew. Sometimes, the answers are not in the textbooks or the exams. Sometimes, the answers are in the hands of the one they never saw. And sometimes, that's enough. He walked out of the hall, his steps light, the silence no longer his cage, but his canvas. The janitor who became a beacon. The invisible man who taught them all. The answers are inside us.